Over 2.5 years ago, I bought this piece of flat ground 12mm 01 tool steel with the intention of making a large chopping knife out of it, just because I thought it would be pretty cool. At the time, I had almost no idea what I was getting into. It has been quite a long journey making this knife. A lot of things have gone wrong, and I've also learned a lot of things along the way. So this video is that story, and I hope you enjoy it. The first step is grinding. As I mentioned earlier, I don't have any professional tools, so that means no forge and no big belt sander which I can remove a lot of material on. One thing I do have though is my £20 Silverline angle grinder, which I bought a couple of years ago, and I'm surprised it is even working anymore. I started off by using thin cut-off discs to remove as much of the excess material as possible. Although this tool steel is supplied in the annealed state, it still takes a long time to cut with the angle grinder, since it's so thick and since 01 is generally quite a tough steel anyway. Cutting a knife out of a material like this in this way is very inefficient material wise and time wise, but I don't have a forge large enough to heat this knife, and I wanted to see how far I could get using my basic tools. I then used thicker grinding discs to refine the shape a little bit. The angle grinder with a cut-off wheel can only cut straight lines, so it was quite difficult to cut the interior curve of this handle, but I could do it by making multiple small cuts and removing the rest of the material using the grinding wheel. I've got this belt sander which is made for sanding wood, and it's way too underpowered for shaping bits of steel this large, but it was still alright for removing small amounts and smoothing up edges. It took many hours of hand filing to get the edges flat and square to the lines. After grinding the profile of the knife, this is what it looks like, and already at this point I'm many hours into the project and quite a few grinding discs down. I was already enjoying the design of this blade, and it was super heavy, and I bet it would have been great for chopping down trees. The next step was to mark the centerline and then start grinding the bevels. So as with the profiles, again I'm going to be using the angle grinder for grinding the bevels. This is far from ideal, and it really took quite a lot of skill not to slip with the angle grinder and ruin all of the work that I'd done already. But the advantage was the angle grinder was really quick at removing material, and it was much quicker than using files or my rubbish belt sander. Very slowly, over the course of many hours and quite a few grinding discs, the shape of the blade finally starts to reveal itself as the bevels are roughed in using the angle grinder. Just grinding in the bevels alone created a good couple kilos of grinding dust. Next, I moved on to sanding drums in a power drill to try and smooth out some of the marks left by the angle grinder. These were quite slow and wouldn't leave a very flat surface, so I quickly moved on to using a belt sander. This is a woodworking belt sander and it removes material far too slowly to be used to grind the entire bevels, but it's quite good at smoothing them out at the very end. The start of the grind is called the plunge line, and it's really important to get this nice and symmetrical. It's impossible to do that on a rubbish belt sander like mine, so I had to resort to hand filing to make them nice and even. Hand filing gives me really good control over the shape of the knife, so I then moved on to draw filing the entire bevel of the blade. This is where I encountered my first problem. While I was using the angle grinder, in some places I left it on the same spot for too long and it's overheated the metal to the point where it's cooled down and hardened. These small spots of metal are way too hard to be cut by a file. It's fine to cut them using abrasives like the belt sander, but it just destroys files. So I needed to anneal the knife before I could move on. I annealed the knife using my electric foundry. This was before I'd built my big electric heat treatment oven. I heated the knife up to around 750 or 800 Celsius and then left it to cool overnight. This should soften all of those hard spots in the metal. After doing that, the blade was really soft and it was really easy to cut into using a file. I could then move on to hand sanding, which is going to smooth out the knife before heat treat. I started the hand sanding just using some 240 grit wet and dry paper on the spine of the blade. Even just sanding the spine of this blade to 240 grit was more surface area than most of the blades that I've ever made, and it took quite a while to get to this point. Then cleaned off all of the oxide and scale from annealing using the belt sander again. You can see that using a worn out belt, the surface finish from the belt sander is actually alright, but it's nowhere near good enough for what I want this before the heat treat, so I move on to hand sanding. The sanding on this blade took absolutely ages and also used up so much sandpaper. I'm pretty sure that the cost of abrasives by this point had already exceeded the cost of the initial metal. However, I thought that it was all worth it still at this point because look how nice the knife looks at this 600 grit finish. This is the knife completely ready to be heat treated and I'm really happy with the way that it's turned out. I can't wait to get it done. It was now time for the first attempt at heat treating this knife, and you'll notice that I say first attempt, and that is because sadly this is where things all started to go wrong. So my thoughts for heat treating this knife were it was just long enough to fit inside my electric foundry that I'd made, and this could control the temperature very accurately using the PID control. I was going to heat it up using that and then quench it in some motor oil. I didn't have a fireproof container that was large enough to hold the motor oil, so I had to use some metal pipe and weld on a piece on the bottom. I was very careful to make sure that the welding was watertight because I wouldn't want it to leak oil everywhere. I filled the pipe all the way up to the top with motor oil. This is just long enough to fit the entire blade of the knife in. I preheated the oil in this modified oven that I made to 160 degrees Celsius. There's loads of information online and I did a lot of research on exactly how to heat treat 01 tool steel. And I can't remember the exact settings I used because I did this heat treat so long ago. I looked at the dates on this footage and it was filmed in March 2018. So I had the foundry aiming at a temperature of around 820 degrees Celsius and I left the knife to soak in that temperature for long enough for it to be consistent throughout the blade. Here you can see the knife is just above the critical temperature for heat treating. It's glowing just cherry red and the heat is quite nice and evenly distributed across the knife. I then took it out and quickly quenched it in the hot motor oil. You can see that as I quench the knife there's loads of flames and the oil's burning off everywhere and everything's way too hot. and when I took out the knife to file test it to see if it was harder than a file, the file was actually able to quite easily cut into it, and I wasn't happy with this heat treat. So the heat treat failed, and I had a theory why. I know the 01 tool steel is easily able to get hard enough to make a knife. The knife is hardened by the changing grain structure of the metal as the steel is rapidly quenched and cooled in the motor oil. I think the problem was the motor oil had a relatively low thermal mass compared to the size of the knife, and because I preheated the oil, it got way too hot as I quenched the knife into it, and then the knife didn't cool down fast enough or to a low enough temperature to get hard enough. I then repeated the whole process, but this time I didn't preheat the oil. And this is where I made a massive mistake that pretty much destroyed this knife. Even though the first heat treat hadn't succeeded in hardening the knife, it had succeeded in imparting loads of stress and strain internally in the metal structure. And before doing this next heat treat, I should have annealed the knife. The slow heating and cooling of the annealing cycle resets the grain structure of the metal and relieves all of the stress in the blade. I didn't do that, however, and this time when I did it, the knife cracked massively all the way down the spine, completely ruining it. You can actually hear the noise of the metal cracking inside the oil, and hundreds of hours of my time completely going to waste. So the knife is actually really hard and it easily passes the file test this time, but it's got this massive crack all the way down the spine and it's pretty much ruined. So there are a couple of reasons why I think this knife cracked. Firstly was that I didn't do the annealing cycle, of course, and there was already loads of internal stress in the steel. Secondly, as I was quenching it in the cold motor oil this time, there was a lot more thermal shock and that could have caused a crack. And thirdly, I actually heated up the knife to a higher temperature this time and didn't leave it to soak as long, so the temperature wasn't as evenly spread throughout the blade, and the higher temperature could have also caused it to crack. So at this point I was pretty annoyed with myself. I'd spent so much time on this knife getting it almost perfect, and then because I couldn't be bothered to anneal it for one more cycle, I was too excited and I rushed it. I completely ruined it. In one last ditch attempt to save this knife, I basically took my angle grinder and tried to grind away the crack all the way down the spine of the knife. I then tried to fill the crack with weld bead to try and see if that would strengthen the knife. I pretty much knew that this wouldn't work, and as expected it didn't work. It literally made the problem worse and just made more and more cracks into the steel. So this is where I gave up with the project for about a year. I was too frustrated with it, I'd wasted hundreds of hours, so I just gave up. In my frustrations, I realised that if I had a better way of heat treating the knife, I would have probably been successful with this project, and I wouldn't be as annoyed at wasting all of this time. Because of this, I decided to actually build an electric heat treatment oven, and I'm really glad that I did. It was such a cool project to make, and it's going to be such a useful tool. That project was super successful, and if you want to see it, then there's a link in the description down below to the tutorial videos that I made on it, and I really recommend checking them out. It was really fun to build. That is where I'm going to end the first part of this video. But all hope is not lost. I didn't abandon this project, and I hate leaving projects unfinished. I did actually come back and use my new heat treat oven to finish the knife, and that will be in next week's video. I think the results are really worth checking out, and it was a really successful project in the end, despite all of this frustration. So the link will be in the description down below to that. So it's been absolutely ages since my last video, literally 8 months, and I've been at university, so I haven't been able to do videos, haven't had access to tools or anything like that, unfortunately. But as like everyone else at the moment in lockdown, I've got a load of free time and I'm finishing off a bunch of projects like this, and it feels really good to finally get them done and upload some videos again. So look for some new content and some exciting new projects over the coming weeks.